It is now my pleasure to turn today's call over to Vinay Nadkarni, Head of Global Business Development. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So we're taping this on the morning of Friday, March 27th. I've learned to timestamp this as we're doing these more frequent webinars. And so I have my teammates, Senior Healthcare Analyst Marshall Gordon and Nick Wu, and we want to make it very topical about what's been going on with COVID-19, really leveraging three kind of key areas. What does this all mean from a social distancing perspective, really leveraging ClearBridge's fundamental access to companies, what's really going on out there, and then thinking about, are there any magic bullets from a cure perspective? So let's, Nick and Marshall, thanks so much for joining us. Nick, I'll throw the first one out to you because we just posted a blog on this yesterday. And really, right, we're living in unprecedented times. Having been in World Trade Center on 9/11 and thinking about the patriotic thing to do was go out and see other people, and that was what the encouragement was. And now we're getting that exact opposite thing, which is really almost antithetical to kind of human behavior. So how, as you are thinking about this and tracking data, thinking about social distancing and how long these restrictions will last?
Yeah, hey Vinay, thanks for the question, and thanks everyone for listening. So like you said, we're really living in extraordinary times. And social distancing and really the question of when restrictions are going to be lifted is one of the key questions from an economic perspective. To try to answer this question or try to address this question, what we did, and again, you can see this in the blog post that Vinay referred to, is that we took a look at the experiences so far in China, in three countries, in China, South Korea, and in Italy. These are three countries that are really further along in the whole process, and they're controlling their initial outbreak, the United States. And we really use these as guideposts to try to figure out what could happen in the United States. So from a high level, the way to think about the lifting of restrictions is really going to depend on the epidemiological situation of the outbreak. And so what we're focused on here is really initially two epidemiological milestones. So the first one is really going to be the number of newly diagnosed cases per day, so the number of people who are diagnosed per day. And the second one is the total number of people, of infected people, or the total number of active cases. So the focus right now is really on New York. New York is the primary hotspot in the United States. And New York is really right now in the teeth of the outbreak. And all you hear about and all you read about is bad news. But we would really take a very different perspective here in that we think that we're actually not all that far away from hitting the first milestone. And again, that's going to be the peak in the number of newly diagnosed patients per day. And once we get to that point, in which we think is going to happen roughly within the next week or so, then we think that that's kind of a signal that we're really starting to make progress. We're not at the top, we're not at the peak, but that's a sign that we're starting to make progress. And once we get to that point, then you can start thinking about the second milestone, and that one is the peak in the total number of infected patients, and really think that we can get to that point about 2 to 4 weeks after hitting the first one, which would really put us out about a month from now. Once we get through those two epidemiological milestones, then we can start thinking about when and really how to lift the social distancing restrictions. And our expectation is that we could start lifting the restrictions, at least in the early coastal regions, kind of in the June timeframe. Our expectation, again, is that this is going to happen on a very gradual basis. It's also going to happen on a regional or more of a rolling basis. Another thing is that the timing from our perspective, from an external perspective, is a little bit difficult to call, more difficult to call, because it's really going to be, the easing of restrictions is really going to be a very subjective decision by policymakers. One of the things that we would really caution about is that lifting of restrictions too early could end up really setting us back. It could really end up really setting us back. If we do it too early, if we get impatient, then we could end up with another outbreak, really kind of leading to another outbreak or kind of an echo outbreak. which would then force us to kind of reset and go through another round of restriction. And really, if we're impatient, what that'll end up doing is prolonging the economic and the community impact of the COVID-19 outbreak. The final thing I wanted to mention is that the key risk to all these timelines is that containment efforts fail to prevent new hotspots from emerging. But what we gain comfort in is that based on taking a look at the experiences of 3 different countries with 3 very different approaches to resolving their own initial outbreaks, they all really ended up in a very similar range of timelines. And we think that these precedents really provides a roadmap for what could happen in the United States.
So Marshall, the way you and Nick traditionally divide up the universe is you handle things more upstream. So obviously you have a lot of insight into what, the practitioners both on the product side and the administration side and the distribution side are thinking about and how they're reacting to that. So what's your take on kind of just your conversation and what's going out there at a practical level?
Sure, and thanks for including me in this. So what I wanted to do, I can kind of look at it. I've had a lot of discussions with pharma companies, biotechnology companies, a number of the players in the drug distribution and sales chain, as well as a lot of different medical device companies within the past week or two, and to really start to understand what's going on and what they're seeing. And I think the easiest place to start is actually in sort of the front lines of medicine, which is the hospitals and doctors' offices. And what you're seeing there are that physicians in hospitals are truly curtailing almost all non-essential care. And they're really shifting to the care of the coronavirus patients, and that's largely in the hospitals. With respect to many specialties, they are also reducing, non-emergency doctor's visits. People are staying home. They're not going to doctor's visits. Some of them are occurring telephonically or via telemedicine, but we are seeing, I think, a reduction there as well, though that it's harder to tell how much reduction there is in non-emergent doctor visits. So in terms of the hospitals, there is a major reduction in non-emergent procedures. What we've seen, outside of the United States, and I think China is the best example, is that in the areas, and actually this was across China, but in the larger cities in China, there was actually an 80 or 90% reduction in some of these elective procedures at the peak of the outbreak in China. And we do actually start to see them come back, and we're already starting to see that. But in terms of in the United States, we're just going into that over the past week or two. It is still regional, with the coastal areas ahead of those of the interior of the country. But we are seeing, things like orthopedic procedures and ophthalmologic procedures. Those are going to be down very substantially. The other implication of all of this is that there's actually going to be fewer diagnoses and new drug starts. When people don't go to the doctors as frequently, they don't go for checkups, etc., there's just going to be fewer opportunities for them to be put on a new medicine for instance, diabetes, or for blood pressure, or really any non-emergent diagnosis. What we are at least taking some comfort in is that patients can still get needed drugs, and we believe are taking them. And what we've heard from both the pharma companies as well as the drug distributors and the drug retailers is that the flow of product, both generic and branded, through the system has been consistent. There haven't been any manufacturing problems. There haven't been any problems with getting drugs from the manufacturers to retail, all the way down to the retail outlets. And in many cases, there's actually been a short-term acceleration of demand where people are making sure that they have perhaps 30 or even 90-day supplies of their medications. And we're going to see that at the end of the first and beginning of the second quarter, where there's probably going to actually be some enhanced volumes of drug sales and or both at retail and in through the pharmaceutical distribution chain. The one thing is there may be a little bit of a slowdown on the back end of that where people are, they have their medications already, but I think overall we see pretty consistent demand. That said, I think it's going to be important to realize that for the drugs that are launching right now, they're going to be a slower launch trajectory than we've typically seen, and that launches could slow, again, because patients are not going in for those new diagnoses. The last thing we're seeing out there is clinical trial activity, which is the lifeblood of the industry, slowing a little bit. For patients in clinical trials or for new patients with very serious medical conditions, we're seeing continued clinical trials. So if you have cancer and you need to be enrolled in a clinical trial to access a potentially new medication, you're still getting that. And the patients that are already in there are having their follow-up visits, et cetera. So there is a little bit of potential disruption with respect to that. But in terms of recruiting new patients for clinical trials, it's definitely getting harder. So what are the broader sort of stock implications of that? Number one is that we are going to see some pretty substantial revenue and profit reductions for companies that manufacture medical devices. The health insurers are going to have some significant losses or medical costs for coronavirus. At the same time, and actually starting at the end of the first quarter, we're going to see a very substantial offset in reduced elective procedures, and that is actually a major cost for a number of, for really throughout the system, so that's going to be a pretty big offset to the direct cost of treating coronavirus. We'll see a little bit lighter growth for pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies, but I think for the most part, the both short and long-term prospects for the biopharmaceutical industry are pretty much unchanged through this. And, the way we look at it is that, there may be or very likely will be a recession at the end of these restrictions due to social distancing, but at the same time, that's unlikely to permanently impact the demand for new medicines and for new medical treatments. And we think that'll be much more durable in an economic recession. I think I'll stop there. Nick, do you have anything to add, or Vinay, any follow-up questions?
I think the only thing I would just add quickly, and if you can do this kind of with I know it's hard to kind of give a specific thing, but when you talk about revenue and profit reductions, how are you stress testing it? What do you think could be the downside, and what areas within like devices could be hit the worst?
So the way we look at it, and when we've spoken to companies, most of them have said that they're certainly going to lose out on the direct sales with an offset for cost of goods. So we're really talking about lost gross profits during certain periods. In terms of the selling general and administrative costs as well as research costs, my understanding is because this is likely to be a disruption measured in months and not years, those costs are likely to continue with maybe only modest reduction. And so you're looking at a pretty substantial drop through for the cost or for lost gross profit to the operating and net earnings lines. In terms of that, look, I think the worst hit are clearly going to be orthopedic procedures because those are very substantial improvements in quality of life, but they're non-essential. We know that cataract procedures, again, similar, very substantial improvements in quality of life, but not life extending. Those are probably going to drop off to the tune of 70, 80, even 90%. I think we're also going to see a lot of even what would have thought to be, cardiac procedures, I think there's less impact, but still some, as well as some sort of general surgery. But I think, once again, the most hardest hit are going to be things like orthopedics and ophthalmology.
And do you see that as a push out? Like this is like in any industry, right? Defense or what? It's like, is this a backlog that builds, or do you think that these could be permanent changes to kind of revenue, or is it more of a deferral for those key areas that you just highlighted?
I think it's definitely more of a deferral. I think there is definitely an investment question around how long it's going to take to sort of dig out of that deferral, because it's pretty substantial, and you're gonna need extra time in things like operating rooms and in surgery centers and things like that, where it isn't totally clear how that plays out. But I think a lot of that is going to come back, and you could see a pretty nice 2021 actually for a lot of those companies, where you're working through normal demand as well as trying to add in additional demand that was deferred from 2020.
Great. So Nick, maybe our last question is, right, I think one of the byproducts of this new social distancing is we spend a disproportionate amount of time on our phones, our computers, or on watching TV. And so you can't be on any of those mediums and not be getting some type of link about some magic bullet treatment that's out there, and how does this actually get solved? So I'll kind of have you lead the discussion on just kind of what your outlook is on drugs and vaccines for this particular pandemic.
Yeah. So thanks, Vinay. Hey, so there's obviously a ton of interest, a ton of news flow in terms of drugs and vaccines for COVID-19. And I think this is both from a personal perspective as well as from a market perspective. I just did a search last night on clinicaltrials.gov, and there were 178 clinical trials going on for COVID-19. It's really an astonishing number. I mean, there's a level of activity that has ramped up over the last month or two. But from a high level, the way I'd put it is that while some of these therapeutics, some of these drugs and vaccines could play an important role in the important medical and societal role in the COVID-19 outbreak, we actually expect that the fundamental financial impact is going to be much smaller and generally immaterial over the long run for most companies. There could be some smaller companies where it's going to matter, but for the most part, it's really not going to be financially material. And I'd really call out two reasons for that. So number one, and probably most importantly, is that no drug company in their right mind is really going to want to be perceived as taking an advantage of a global health crisis. So it's really unlikely, and it'd be extremely unwise to try to get premium pricing for any drug or vaccine that gets approved for COVID-19. I mean, one specific example, Gilead, who's been one of the companies that's been attracting the most attention because of its drug remdesivir, has been very clear that they're not working on this to try to monetize a drug. They're working on this to try to be part of the solution for COVID-19. The second thing I'd point out is that what we've seen historically from other pandemic situations is that sales as a result of pandemic, or drug sales as a result of pandemics, tend to be very short-lived. The companies will get a short bump or get a big bump for a short period of time, and then the sales dissipate over time. And investors generally don't give companies credit for short-term benefits. Kind of looking out, I think it's relevant to think about the timelines for when we could start seeing the availability of some of these newer drugs and vaccines. And I would really think of those two, drugs and vaccines, in two different buckets in terms of timelines. Drugs will be first. I think it's possible that the first of these drugs could be available, could be approved for COVID-19 within the next 2 to 3 months. We're going to start seeing the first data from really solid, well-designed, randomized trials probably in the next month, in April or so. And if they're positive, and we'll have to see how it turns out, but if they're positive, FDA could move very quickly in terms of approving a drug. I mean, they fully understand the situation, and are working very collaboratively with companies to try to be part of the solution. Vaccines, on the other hand, I think is a very different situation, and we think it's most likely to be approved. I mean, the first one, if successful, is most likely to be approved no earlier than 12 months, and probably more like 18 to 24 months. And the very simplistically, the reason for that is that the safety bar for a vaccine is much higher than for a drug. For a vaccine, you're essentially administering something to a healthy individual, so there's very little tolerance. There's a very low tolerance for any sort of safety issues. So you just need a lot of patients, which means a lot of time in order to establish that safety bar. For drugs, you're giving them to an infected patient who would otherwise have an adverse outcome, so you're willing to tolerate more adverse events, and so you need fewer patients to demonstrate safety, so faster timelines there. The last thing I wanted to go through is really I'll just mention a couple of the drugs that are kind of in the news flow today. And really, I guess I'd put into three different buckets. So one of them is Gilead's remdesivir, is the one I've mentioned before. The second bucket is a couple of generic drugs for malaria and I guess other autoimmune indications, currently available, trying to being repurposed. And those are called chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. Those are very chemically related, so I guess kind of go in the same bucket. And the third one is a couple of antibodies that are also very related, Roche's Actemra and Sanofi's Kevzara. Again, they're antibodies against a cytokine that may be involved in the inflammatory process that kind of causes some of the downstream or later stage symptoms of COVID-19. So again, three different buckets. They're all very different drugs. They could end up having very different roles in the treatment of COVID-19. But at this point, I would actually describe our outlook for them in a very similar way, in that I think that all of them have some level of interesting data from early clinical trials. But all of the data so far, all the trials so far are very small. They're very imperfect in a lot of ways. And we're really far from providing, or they're really far from providing any sort of definitive evidence that the drugs work in COVID-19 patients. So so we're going to start seeing some of the data again over the next month or two. So the way I guess I would describe our outlook is that we're hopeful, but not necessarily confident about them. It's very well possible that some of them could work, and again, we're hopeful about it. But we think that if any of these first wave of drugs work, and again, remember, they're all repurposed. They were actually none of them were actually designed to target COVID-19. So we believe that if any of the first wave of drugs do work, the benefits are really going to be a lot more incremental, and none of them are really going to be a panacea. They're going to be really a very good first step to help manage the crisis, the immediate crisis. But over a couple of year time frame, we really think that the next generation of more purpose-built drugs that are actually designed specifically, drugs and vaccines for that matter, that are designed specifically to target COVID-19, are going to come along and supplant them and really be a more substantial improvement upon the first wave of drugs.
Forgive me that I don't know this. When was the last major vaccine that was created that people in the U.S. use, and how long did that take? Do you even know the answer to that? Like, forgive me that not being an expert in this, but when was the last time we actually had to go through this kind of process? And obviously, I think there's such a pent-up need for this that, as you said, you're not going to want to rush traditional efficacy or safety standards. I just don't know the last time we even had a recent example of this.
So Marshall, do you have anything to chime in here?
Yeah, I can maybe offer a little bit of color because I spent some more time on vaccination. In terms of the last pandemic, that was the pandemic flu vaccine. It was probably in the 2008-2009 timeframe. And what I would say there is that that's probably not a good analog because we have a very specific process for designing and updating flu vaccines. Prior to that, the biggest vaccine innovation in recent times that I can think of were the there's pneumococcal vaccines that are currently under clinical trial development, both for children and for adults, and those are being dosed to tens of thousands of patients, and those are probably taking 2 years or a year and a half at least to just recruit the patients for the clinical trials. Prior to that, there were vaccines developed for meningococcal disease, which is a bacterial infections, and those took a year, or probably more like 2 years for clinical trials, and again were thousands of patients large for clinical trials to read out. Again, because there you are dosing healthy patients, and you really do need to explore the full safety profile of the vaccines. So these are multi-year types of trials typically, and you probably can accelerate that to a certain extent in terms of enrollment, but you still need to follow these patients for a while after vaccination to make sure that these vaccines are safe.
Actually, sorry, so I actually do remember a somewhat of a relevant example. So there was the Ebola vaccine a few years ago, and I think those timelines were kind of along the 12 to 18 month. I don't remember exactly, but that's the right ballpark. And I think that's one of the reasons that people kind of come up with this sort of 12-month at the bottom end and more like 18 to 24-month time period.
Great. Well, thanks, Marshall and Nick, for doing this on short notice. I know you guys got a lot of interactions with companies and to stay on top of, so really appreciate it. Thanks to all the listeners for listening in. I'll close with our disclosure. So please note the following: that past performance is no guarantee of future results. The opinions and views expressed in today's call are of the individual speakers as of March 27, 2020. And may differ from other managers or the firm as a whole, and are not intended to be a forecast of future events, clearly, a guarantee of future results, or investment advice. Any statistics referenced have been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, but the accuracy and completeness of this information cannot be guaranteed. Neither ClearBridge nor Investments nor its information providers are responsible for any damages or losses arising from any use of this information. So thank you, and have a great weekend, everybody.